presented by Alyssa Cordner and Lauren Richter. Alyssa Cordner is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Whitman College. She'll come up and do her presentation, and then Lauren will piggyback on her. And Laurel is a doctoral candidate in Sociology and Anthropology at Northeastern University. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lena. Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I know it's the end of a long and mentally overwhelming day, so thanks for hanging with us. And we're going to sort of change the focus a little bit and talk to you from a sociological and social science perspective to begin. So we're representing the Social Science Environmental Health Research Institute, or CERI, here at Northeastern, led by Phil Brown, our fearless leader, along with a group of other faculty, postdocs, grad students, and undergraduate research assistants. I teach at Whitman College in Washington State, not here at Northeastern. And the research group, and in particular the PFAS group within CERI, works on the science, regulation, and activism associated with PFASs. It's anchored in Phil's previous work on contested illnesses, environmental health, social movements, and the exposure experience, including a previous NSF grant looking at the social and scientific discovery of flame-retardant chemicals, a different concerning class of emerging contaminants, as well as research by two folks who've already received their doctorates from Northeastern and Brown University, Matt Judge, who looked at biomonitoring in the Ohio River Valley, and Becky Altman, who looked at the exposure experience and different chemical exposures. So to give a little overview of what Lauren and I will talk about today, we're interested in the aspects of the PFAS case that are of interest to us as social scientists, in particular, the barriers that prevent knowledge from moving between various sectors. We've heard a lot about what facilitates and what might impede the movement of information and the potential change that can come as a result of that information. So we're interested in how environmental health knowledge is produced and how it is used. So we follow the chemicals and we follow the science. Our goal is to understand how science is strategically produced and strategically used by multiple institutions. And today we'll talk briefly about 3 moments of discovery, moments you've heard a little bit about already. And we'll use these moments to talk about the divergent trajectories that science can take. And as I think will become clear by the end of our talk, we see this recent mapping work by EWG and CERI as an example of successful social and scientific discovery. So we'll talk about, we'll give you answers to, the computer has frozen, so I will just tell you what our research questions are. We are interested in, it's frozen even more. There we go. It came back to life. Thank you, computer. We are interested in how the dangers of PFAS have been discovered, interpreted, and acted upon. And we're interested in what accounts for uneven social and scientific discoveries of chemicals after what's now been decades of research, litigation, regulation, and activist awareness. In particular, why doesn't more knowledge lead to more action? If we think about the dominant social narrative around science, around information, that dominant narrative, or what we in sociology might call the hidden argument, is that with more knowledge, with education, with information, comes action, comes change. You know, we have to understand something, we have to study something in order to create change, and you can see that in the dominant narrative around the passage of the Superfund Act. On the left-hand side there, you can see that after we learned about Love Canal, then the EPA acted. And what this hidden argument obscures is the very real and important political and activist and social movement work that underpins that scientific knowledge. It's not just that we learned in a neutral way that there was contamination at Love Canal. Instead, the process of scientific discovery and social discovery were highly contested and involved a lot of conflicts between different groups of stakeholders. We can also see this with information, with our understanding of PFOA in the sort of mainstream website world. This is a Google Trends that looks at the percentage of a single word showing up in all books and printed materials. You can see certainly spikes at various points in time, but what's interesting that Lauren has observed at various points is that if you look at when the C8 panel studies came out, 2012-ish, there's not a big spike in social. There doesn't seem to be a corresponding increase in at least what's captured by the Google Trends. Instead, we see a significant increase in around 2015 following the awareness of Hoosick Falls contamination, following the New York Times story, for example. And so there's this fluctuating and inconsistent social awareness that doesn't line up necessarily with increases in scientific knowledge. So what we're interested here is the relationship between scientific discovery and social discovery. And here we are drawing on the work of sociologist Sheldon Krimsky and his work on the endocrine disruptor hypothesis. In that work, he talked about the social discovery as the growing awareness of a previously unrecognized or poorly understood problem, disease, hazard, or phenomenon. So it's that growing awareness of something that's previously poorly understood. And we see as a related but distinct concept the idea of scientific discovery, which involves the establishment of a research base on a given topic by people who are institutionally located in sites of science, government, academia, and industry. And we want to explore the different relationships that can exist between social discovery happening in the non-scientific or the lay public world, and scientific discovery that happens in these various sites of scientific practice. And there are multiple possible relationships indicated by different arrows up there on the slide. Scientific discovery can lead to more social discovery. Scientists find something out, they share it, it leads to social discovery and social action. On the flip side, we often see that social discovery inspires scientific discovery. When members of the public or non-scientists identify environmental or health concerns, which then inspires the work by scientists. There can also be barriers between the two. We'll talk about some of these barriers when Lauren gets to talking about the specific moments. Scientific discovery does not always lead to social discovery, and social discovery will not always lead to scientific discovery. So our methods are a multi-method approach with a large research team. We've conducted over 70 in-depth interviews and also some additional informal or off-the-record interviews and conversations. We thank those of you in the audience who we have interviewed for this project. We also conducted multi-sited ethnography. Lauren's conducted some longer-term ethnographic internships with various offices around the country. And we conduct short-term observations at various meetings, including this meeting here today, scientific, industry, and activist meetings as well, or community meetings, I should say. We have a large group of researchers, including a number of undergraduates who've been able to go out and do interviews at various sites. This is very much an ongoing research project, and as a part of this, we're developing a tracking system to identify all of the numerous issues of the numerous sites of contamination around the country and put them all together into a database that now is linked up with the EWG's mapping of the UCMR data. And now I'll turn it over to Lauren.
Thank you. So briefly, I will describe 3 moments of discovery in the PFAS story. These discoveries occurred in distinct stakeholder groups. Some discoveries made news headlines, others remained in industry hands for decades until courts mandated their release. Examining knowledge production across different stakeholder groups is important. As Alyssa mentioned earlier, we carry dominant cultural assumptions that science and scientific data are somehow pure, without human influence, and that data speak for themselves. Social science finds that in practice, this is not the case. These are politically laden processes. So the first moment I will describe, an industry scientific discovery made in 1981. A lot of the discoveries I'll talk about have already been touched on today, so I'll be brief. What's of interest to us in the year 1981 is that 3M conducts the rodent study and finds a significant relationship between C8 exposure and rat pup birth effects. They share this information with DuPont, and they share this information with EPA under TSCA. Later that same year, DuPont and 3M reproduce those studies and conclude that there is no relationship between C8 exposure and rat pup birth effects. They report this to the EPA, concluding there's no significant relationship, and by implication, perhaps nothing additional to explore here. What DuPont did not disclose to EPA in 1981 was that they were monitoring pregnant employees, and they were finding some concerning health outcomes and birth effects, which others have described today. And so what's one conclusion from this looking at this moment is that scientific discoveries were made, but the science they produced were rendered structurally invisible to stakeholders outside of industry. Moment 2, social discovery on the farm. In the 1990s, the Tennant family sold a portion of their land to DuPont for non-hazardous waste disposal. Within years, they noticed and documented massive cattle die-offs, wildlife health effects, and had their own health concerns as well. The Tennants had no success in approaching regulatory authorities and eventually contacted Rob Villatte to pursue litigation, which is no easy undertaking to pursue litigation against DuPont, as Rob detailed today. And really, it was an improbable alignment of factors that led to this social discovery, a single source on an individual landowner's, on a farm owned by one landowner, and it had a remarkable dramatic health effect. That's very rare for us to see in the world of chemical exposures and health impacts. So arguably, it's almost an accident that we even know about PFASs, and this event led to the successful litigation that Rob pursued. And so this social discovery on the Tennant farm led to an initial lawsuit that led to Rob Villatte finding PFOA and requiring DuPont to disclose their internal studies. And so this social discovery led to the discovery of prior social discoveries within industry. And finally, litigation-inspired scientific discovery. As was discussed today, the remarkable class action lawsuit and C8 science panel required very sophisticated medical monitoring and epidemiological studies done on the population in the Mid-Ohio Valley. And these scientific discoveries led to greater social discoveries. Residents of the Mid-Ohio Valley found out for the first time that they were drinking water that had contaminants and that there were concerning health effects. And as we know recently, over 3,000 people with one of the 6 diseases linked to PFOA exposure have settled a huge lawsuit with DuPont. So again, this interesting relationship between different pathways of scientific discovery and social discovery. Thank you. So layering these 3 moments on the earlier figure that Alyssa showed, the relationship between scientific discoveries and social discoveries, we are interested in how these moments relate to each other. Are broader discoveries made, or are they not made? And how do these moments contribute to the broader history of PFAS knowledge production? Moment 1, the industry discovery had very limited impact on broader scientific, health research, and no social discovery resulted. Next, moment 2, the social discovery on the farm. The Tennant's unique position and drive led to the lawsuit and Rob's work in the discovery process of requiring DuPont to hand over documents that revealed the discoveries that happened in the 80s and 50s and 60s and 70s, as we heard today. This was a huge moment, perhaps the most significant moment of discovery for the Tennant family. Had they not acted, we might not know about PFAS today. And finally, moment 3, litigation-inspired scientific discovery. Significant academic and social discoveries have been made and are continue to be made based on the C8 science panel research, including the discovery in Hoosick Falls of water contamination. As many of you may know, Michael Hickey did some research online searching for the types of cancers he was observing in Hoosick Falls, came across the C8 science panel studies, and that's how we got the idea to test the water for PFOA and make this discovery that has inspired this whole recent wave of discoveries across the country. So to summarize the implications of these 3 moments, little to no action came out of the industry discovery, and interestingly, there was no action that we know of that the EPA took. In the second moment, the non-scientific, the social discovery, it was an enormous discovery, leading eventually to successful litigation that then inspired the C8 science panel. And I think it's important to note that The medical monitoring and epidemiological study, the quality, the quantity of data were only completed because industry was coerced to fund independent research. And unfortunately, this is extremely rare to have this type of data collection done. As many have mentioned today, there's been a recent wave of social discoveries across the country, widespread media coverage, and the story is getting out and spreading. In terms of implications for coalition and community building, since scientific data alone will not bring about change, social movements, again, are leading the movement to restrict the use of PFASs and more broadly re-envision a new regulatory apparatus protective of public health. This has repeatedly been the case historically, thinking about the early occupational health movement, environmental movements in the 60s and 70s, and it was social movements that brought about the establishment of the EPA and our suite of environmental protection laws. And so something that we're observing today is a multi-sector alliance, evidenced by the range of stakeholders in the room today. And it is extremely important that actors in distinct stakeholder groups collaborate together to create strong coalitions and broad social movements. There are also significant challenges for communities facing contamination. Social science research finds that in addition to the health impacts, the quantifiable impacts for communities living in contaminated spaces, there are significant challenges to community cohesion. Unlike natural disasters, which social scientists find actually foster cohesion, technological disasters, chemical exposure, tend to have corrosive effects on communities, producing fear, blaming, infighting, and leadership struggles. That said, historically, it is communities and social movements that have been successful in pushing forward policy that protect public health. As mentioned by Sylvia and Ken earlier today, communities and social movements are our hope and our collective power, and the successful route to substantial health protective chemical regulation. Ultimately, it is up to us to decide whose responsibility it should be to test, track, and intervene in ubiquitous and growing chemical contamination. Scientific imperceptibility is not inevitable, and knowledge production should not have to flow through contaminated bodies in order for us to take action. To conclude, the point we want to make is that knowledge production happening in industry, in communities, in academic spaces, doing science, interpreting science, and acting on science, they look different depending on the institutional context where they're happening. Prior work by Alyssa has helped our understanding of strategic science translation, stakeholders translating science for various ends. And in this project, we're beginning to look at strategic science production. In particular, we're interested in the barriers to scientific knowledge production, and our hope is to identify structural barriers to help create structural solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa and Lauren. Next, we're going to have Dr. Tony Fletcher. He's an environmental epidemiologist and associate professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and he also served as one of the C8 Science Panel.
So, thank you very much for inviting me, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about other exposure scenarios and what we can learn from them in Europe, where I'm from. And first of all, I should congratulate you. We've been here 9 hours. It's a very long endurance test. Thank you for staying till the end. I'm also one of the 3-member C8 Science Panel that's been mentioned in the various presentations earlier. And I've been also asked to comment on any kind of lessons and comparisons arising from that. And I could talk for a long time about that, but after 9 hours you don't want to hear me talk. So I'll try and be brief. What I'm going to do is talk about two interestingly different exposure scenarios, both of which I've been invited to collaborate a little on the planned research, and then make a few closing remarks about the C8 panel. First to Sweden. Here in southern Sweden, you can see in the map there's a firefighting foam exposure scenario, which is the town of Ronneby. The red X marks where the waterworks is. The white area on the left is an airfield, and it's a military airfield, and they had a lot of training recruits. In fact, they had weekly exercises using firefighting foam with containing perfluorinates. And just quite by chance, there was a bit of budget left in 2013, and they thought they had a little extra analysis to some routine analysis of water in the waterworks. Found very high levels of PFOS and PFHXS, and that raised the alarm. And I have to say, with credit to the Swedish authorities, within a day, the water had been stopped, the problem had been identified, and they, and in fact, about a third of the population, there's two different water supplies covering this town of Kallinga, of Ronneby rather, and so about a third, some nearly 10,000 people were exposed to significant levels of contamination, which had been running. I mean, the use of firefighting foam had been going on since about the 1980s, and the results on the left-hand side, it's in Swedish, but the abbreviations are the same, identify the chemicals in brackets, which you see PFOS, PFHXS, and were the two highest, and then there was significant butane sulfonate, heptane, and hexane acids. And so this is typical. There's a complicated mixture of chemicals used in firefighting foams. They've been trying to find out what they are, and the military say they have no records, of course, but it's very difficult to reconstruct. And talking to Andy, probably there's another long list of other ones which are below the detection of the analytical tools they were using. Anyway, they cut off that the contaminated well, and now the supply of water to the community, shown on the right-hand side of that chart, is all much lower. People were exposed. They've just started the research program, and this is showing for a subsample of the population the decreasing trends since well, that's 2014 to 2016. The two top lines are PFOS and PFHXS. This is the average, and the population in the exposed area has got an average of about 300 nanograms per mil of each of these two compounds. The lower line, the dark line, is PFOA, which is at about 14, which is about sort of 4 to 5 times background level. But the two highest ones are much higher, and in fact, hexane sulfonate, it's probably the highest well-characterized exposure scenario anywhere. Now this is showing, there's been a bit of talk about long half-lives for these compounds, and this is just to underline another point, which is that the half-life varies a lot between individuals. The average, you've got hexane sulfonate at the top, we found about 5.5 years, PFOS about 3.5 years, and PFOA is 2.7 years at the average half-life, but around that average there's a big variability, which reflects different amounts of water that people drink, but also the different rate of biological processing that individuals have, which affects the excretion rate and therefore the amount that's left in their body. And it's quite important for understanding the risks associated with these. So this has only happened very recently. The only results so far have been these preliminary results on on half-life, but the plan now is to execute a number of health studies. And the unique feature here is, in particular, this high exposure to both PFOS and hexane sulfonate. And so Sweden has a very good record linkage system, so one can link the personal identity number to birth records, cancer records, death registries, and so on. And various record linkage studies are planned, as well as biobank studies, this half-life study I've already mentioned, responding to all the hypotheses raised in that long list of associations identified in studies published already, to try and improve both the identification of diseases linked to these high exposure scenarios, but also there's a number of mechanistic studies that are planned too, genetic studies, kidney function, the determination of half-life and excretion rates, and so a number of interesting studies will emerge. The second example I want to give is in the northeast corner of Italy, close to, you've all heard of Venice, and Veneto region is the geographic region, including Venice, which is on the right-hand side. And on the inland part, there's a town called Vincenzo, which is buried in the middle of that red zone. And that's, the colors are giving you an idea of the exposure zones. The little diagram at the bottom is showing the exposure plume. And essentially coming out of a plant that was manufacturing PFOS and a number of shorter chain perfluorinates, there was exposure over a number of years, and this was discovered also more or less by accident. It was there was a group participating in a PERFOOD, which was a European study of food-related sources, and they saw this cluster of rather high levels of serum in the population, and looked in more detail and found there was this very high rate of emission. The compounds that were most implicated were PFOA and PFOS, and those charts are just illustrating the levels, which went up to over 1,000 nanograms per liter for PFOA and about 100 for PFOS, both above their respective limits. They're the horizontal lines. And following the introduction of activated charcoal filtration, the levels are much lower. Still raised, but somewhat lower. Interestingly, the other perfluoride, the other PFAS all added together, which is the bottom of those three charts, they've remained high, and the reason they've remained high is one of the largest components is PFBS, which was manufactured as a substitute, and they were still sloppy about emissions into the local water supply from the factory, and it's not the activated charcoal's filtration at the effluent from the plant just doesn't stop the PFBS at all. So the population, although it's below for that specific compound, it's below the relevant default guidance value, is being continued for PFBS. And a sample of serum has been taken, and the top charts are showing for PFOA and PFOS that the levels are falling. That's the average in the community. But you can see the bottom one, which is the sum of the other PFAS, is not falling because of this problem of the short chain ones not being filtered, and they're trying to improve and reduce that. So how much are they exposed? This bar chart, the population affected is about 80,000 altogether, and in the red zone, and the mean of that serum level for PFOA, which was the highest, is about 13 in that. That's the second column in that, which is the average PFOA in that area, and the ULSS, that's a health department classification, and the highest exposure was at an average of 74, which split into several towns. This is just illustrating for 3 different towns the number of people exposed. So Lorigo, which is the largest, is about 16,000 people. and the average serum levels are about 110 parts per billion, and the next one down is about 60 parts per billion, another 6,000 people exposed, and then the third one, I'm sure how much that is, about 50 parts per billion, there is about 7,000 exposed. So we have some 20 to 30,000 people with levels in the range 20 to 120 parts per billion. So probably if you add them together, it's a larger population even than the C8 population we studied before. So this again has only just been discovered. There are one or two ecological studies of the general sort of comparison between the red and the orange areas of cancer and birth outcomes. But it's too early to see what results there really are from this study. And special features here, a very large study of before, but in particular there's this large exposure to PFBS, which again is unique in a chance to study the effects of this under researched PFAS example. And there will be other, I'm wondering also whether there's other, a more complex soup, but there's about 10 that have been identified in the water supply so far. So what's planned? There's a big program run by the Veneto region offering monitoring for everybody, so they're collecting volunteers at the moment. With there's a target population of 80,000, they have a budget to be able to do 40,000 samples, they say. And it's planned to do registry-based studies, and a cohort study is planned. And as I say, although the main exposure is before, there is a complex mixture. So I think this will add something to the literature. So finally, a few comments about the C8 science panel. I was particularly asked about what were the lessons learned, what was unique, and what are the challenges to carry on research there. I'd just like to say this was unique, and it's already been mentioned, that most litigation exercises involve cleanup and compensation and maybe punitive damages, but it's very rare that there's an acknowledgement that there is uncertainty, and that rather than just having the experts on each side argue about that uncertainty, it was decided to try and improve the raw data on which, in this case, the second phase of that settlement, but more generally, future litigation can be based on research. So, it's not just self-interest. I think it's a good idea that some of the research, and if any of the other lawyers are here, I commend them to keep this in mind as a good model to follow for future tort settlements. It does take some time. It doesn't take 7 years, which was a number mentioned earlier. I mean, it was about 2 years for the first survey, the C8 Health Project, to be finished and the data cleaned up and handed over to us, and then it took us about 4 years. So research does take a little bit of time, but that's what it takes to have a reasonable answer. And of course, although we made those probable links, some of them will be verified and proven in the future, and everyone will agree that they're real causal associations. Some may not. They may not get tested again. Some of them are hypotheses because they're the first results. No one else has made a link between any of these exposures and ulcerative colitis or preeclampsia. So it's important that these are planned to replicate exactly those two outcomes, for example, in the Swedish and Italian ones. So challenges for doing. We all tried, myself and my two fellow science panelists, tried to get further funding to do further follow-up on these, in particular in the R01 system with NIHS. Unfortunately, we weren't successful. Now, maybe we didn't write good enough grants. Of course, there's a competition. But in each case, the reviewer said, oh, PFOA, it's history. It's been banned, it's been phased out. We don't need more research on that. And I'm glad to see they haven't all been rejected on that basis, and you've got 32 other projects that were funded. Well, I'm a bit sorry none of them were the ones we were doing. We'll maybe try again.
Happy to talk about it.
Oh, well, you too. So my final comment, though, is I've done that research, and that was a very interesting experience for me, and I hope for the people reading our papers. And for these two other examples, we prioritized doing research to answer questions about PFBS, about PFHXS, and for PFOA, seeing if we could replicate the results. That's a good idea, but I was listening earlier and thinking, well, research isn't always the answer. The Dordrecht example was mentioned, where a DuPont plant in Holland had contaminated the water supply. RIVM, the local public health institute, did some measurements of blood, did a risk assessment, and decided it's enough. It was a relatively small increase. Research would be almost certainly negative, and so it wouldn't be a good idea to raise people's expectations about being able to prove anything with research. Do a risk assessment, clean up the plant, stop exposure, and that's the end of it. So it's not always the right thing to do, and I see tomorrow there will be a session that Greg Howard and Tom Webster are doing on, how you make a decision about what's right. Doing research, doing biomonitoring, stopping talking, I'll stop in a moment. And there is, one needs to, that's an important thing, not always to rely on doing that. But my final comment is going back to something that Alan Duckerman said. These compounds do have rather funny dose responses. In our case, and he showed the example of cholesterol, we had exposure ranges from nothing right up to 20,000, the highest individual. Most of them were under 100, but all the steepest dose response was between 0 and 30 parts per billion in the blood. And so large populations that have low exposure, where one can identify the individual exposure, and some of the examples we heard earlier, even though it's a low exposure, it is very informative. The classic toxicology, like you do with animals, is you want a high exposure contrast to prove something. But it doesn't help if the dose response of interest is in the lower exposure range. So, it's not just, you need to be able to do a good study and have a reasonably large population to get the statistical power, but even these low exposure populations are worth studying. And with that, I thank you. I'm sorry I overran. Just one other thing is, just I learned 2 days ago that the WHO has put out a report which describes in great detail the Italian scenario. And so, because up till now you've had to work out through Italian publications, but it's there, the one on the left, and I commend you to have a look at that.
Great, thank you very much, Tony, and thank you to all our panelists for all the important work that they're doing. So we'll open it up for about 10-12 minutes of discussion if you have any questions. So it looks like there's one back there.
This is Tony, and I don't know how to pose this other than a theoretical. Let's say you and your colleagues got $1 billion. Would you guys know what to do as far as a health study in America? And would you, we're looking for a national kind of study on veterans or on the general population that's been exposed to PFASs. And if you had the money, could you guys design studies that would be powerful and effective in communicating, deciding what these chemicals are doing? I'll come up with $1 billion, okay?
We have a principle, if you can find us $1 billion, we can always find a way to spend it. Making too much noise. I'm not sure how to answer that. Another area that's... That one off. Put that one off. Yeah, it's near enough. There is another story about this class of chemicals which I would suggest that the research emphasis was on, which is that not only do these chemicals seem to have a wide range of biological activities, but also we are very reliant on using serum levels as an indicator of exposure. And I mentioned there was a variability in people's half-lives. But one of the problems is that the things that determine our individual variation in half-lives also affect the risk of the diseases and the biomarkers that we're interested in studying. So what I would like is less emphasis on just the general population where you don't know where they're getting their exposures from, to an emphasis on populations where you can identify high and low exposure, including these relatively low exposure groups, in order to tease out both not only the contrasts of exposure measured by serum levels, but also the contrasts of exposure measured by true differences in their external exposure. But I'll stop that, because otherwise I won't be able to spend your $1 billion.
$1 billion is my budget for a year. I just wanted to, again, kind of for Tony, you know, I think this issue of the steepest part of the dose response curve being in the lowest dose region is something that we are seeing more and more and more with many, many chemicals. And it's really important. Traditional tox studies don't ever get in that region, but modern 21st century toxicologists are in fact looking in those regions. So for example, you know, this is an example of a perfluorinated compound. So if you look at benzene, if you look at arsenic, if you look at many other compounds, where do you find the steep part of the curve is early? That's one point. And then the other thing is, I mentioned this morning, not all, at least let's say, of the modern toxicology studies are done at doses that are really high if you focus on what the internal dose is.
We don't need to reply to it.
Again for Tony, I'm over here. Can you finish this sentence? You said, even health studies at low level exposures are worth it because?
It's kind of related to what Linda just said, that the conventional notion of toxicology is the dose makes the poison. The bigger the dose, the more the effect you expect to have. Therefore, if you don't find something at a high exposure, you would therefore not expect to find something with a lower exposure contrast. But that's not true if your population is mainly at the kind of at the part of the dose response curve where it's flattened off. So when I meant it's worthwhile studying, even a low exposure group is worth studying, is because it might be very powerful to detecting these biological effects at relatively low exposures. But with the caveat that I would like them also to be cases where you can really distinguish contrast in population exposure as well as contrast in internal body burden, because although internal body burden is obviously important, if my liver's bathed in the fluids in my body, so that the internal dose is important, but you have this problem of active reabsorption that can be a confounder, because your serum level is affected by both your individual rate of recycling these chemicals and it may be correlated with a health outcome of interest.
I'd like to ask a question about, in Italy, what was the source of information?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was a factory called Miteni, which was manufacturing perfluorinated compounds for other people. So they were selling before to Teflon manufacturers and so on, PFOS to the garments, and I discovered, so I said, what do they use PFBS for? And I was told one of the uses was for artificial tears, for people whose tear ducts don't work. There are diverse uses and not all malevolent.
My next question, or follow-up or actual question, is if someone can speak to the the elevated blood levels, the serum levels, and versus exposure to different sources of the PFAS compounds? You know, is it really, can you point me to groundwater is the most likely source? Is it the
In which
fire?
context?
Well, in general, in terms of different,
No, when you have a local hotspot, like those 3 examples the C8 and then those 2 examples I gave, then yes, we've identified that groundwater contamination and drinking water was the dominant source. But for the general population, I don't know how it is here, but a European study identified that food was predominantly the main route of PFOS and PFAS uptake, either through food packaging or through vegetable uptake and animals eating contaminated feed.
In the EPA Health Advisory, the document they released in 2016, they assumed that drinking water was 20% of total exposure. And the majority did come from food, but they acknowledged a lot of uncertainty and variability between different populations. Oh, you.
Dr. Fletcher, are you at liberty to say how the funding works on the studies you were discussing for Sweden and Italy, where the funding's coming from?
Absolutely. The funding in Italy is mainly from the regional health people, the Veneto region, who have funded the work so far and are continuing to fund it. And they particularly have complained that they can't apply the polluter pays principle. That the company has refused to pay for any of either the municipal water treatment nor any of the health, and certainly not the health studies. And they are now preparing a case, a legal case, a criminal case from the regional prosecutor against the company, in part to try and recover some of those costs, and also punitively. And for the Swedish case, they're applying to their research budgets, like the RO1 system, but in the Swedish context, applying for competitive grants to do these research projects.
Okay, it looks like we have time for 2 more questions, so we have Al back here.
So this is about something that I was rushing so much I neglected to add, and it becomes a question for Tony to see if he's seen the same thing in his work. We've looked now, actually looked at something that was done at School of Hygiene. We looked at I think the bottom 20% of the bottom decile of C-reactive protein to see if we could see a threshold beneath which nothing happened. And that's in a large C8 health population for the adults, and the answer is no. The curve looks exactly the same, however far down you go, for as far down as we can follow it. And there was a hint of that in the cholesterol data done by Frisbee, who was our grad student way back when, because she initially looked at vigiciles, which she taught me was when you divide things into 20. But I know, Tony, you're looking at cholesterol to see if you can see a threshold. Have you gotten far enough to see if you can see one at any dose?
There is no, I was looking at that a few weeks ago, and there's no suggestion of a PFOA-related threshold within the range sort of 1 to 10. It doesn't. It may be at less than 1 part per billion, but the data gets quite noisy because the groups get small down there. PFOS, it looks like there might be a suggestion of a threshold below about 3 parts per billion, but not for PFOA. But the data is kind of noisy for both.
One last question over here.
Oh, I just have like a question or a comment for Dr. Fletcher and Dr. Bierbaum and Dr. Duckman about the low dose. But like in the toxicology studies, this is about the toxicology, not the human. When we reviewed them, some of the studies, the control, because these chemicals are pervasive and just like we're exposed to them, animals are too. Sometimes there's data on the PFOA or levels in the control groups, and if the low dose response thing is really happening in animals too, we feel that we might be missing part of the dose response curve in the tox studies for the low dose effects because the controls are already on the dose response curve.
or... Okay, thank you.
Okay, we can take this last question here.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. This question is for Dr. Fletcher. So you mentioned the variability of half-lives among individuals to metabolize these PFASs. Is it fair to say that some of us have good metabolizers and others are not? And I also wonder, what do you think is the factors that determine the different capacity of different people? Is that genetic factors or is that lifestyle factors? If one person is bad at metabolizing people, is that person also bad at PFAS and all the others?
Right, very astute question, thank you. I think I use the word metabolize as well. I think that's actually the wrong word to use, in that it's not metabolized like broken down. It's a question of differential excretion. The chemical is very hardy and it's not really affected by going through our bodies. What happens is that it is cycled. The stuff in your blood, it gets put into your kidneys and it doesn't quite get excreted. It gets reabsorbed through the kidney. And similarly, some goes into the gut and gets reabsorbed through the intestinal lining. So the rate at which it's reabsorbed, both from the gut and the kidney, varies between individuals, and there's some thought that that might be due to genetic variations in these so-called organic anion transporter proteins that are implicated in this recycling process in both the gut and the kidney. And probably the other factors regulating both gut health, like the microbiome or kidney function, and we know that kidney function varies between individuals. So there'll be some things that are genetic and some that are time varying.
Thank you very much. Can we thank our panel for the last time?
Thanks everybody for a great day. We're going to call it quits for today. If people have